This series began in spring of 2018 when the Humanities Center began a major and ambitious exploration of the three underlying concepts that constituted the foundation of USD's at its inception, the beauty, goodness, and truth statement. That I see Sister Rodie is here, and she kicked us off describing how that phrase really expresses who we are here at USD in many ways. So at its core, not in many ways, at its heart. So the plan of the series was to look at each of these words or each of these ideas through different disciplines or different perspectives. Anyway, today we conclude with a second and very serious critique of the concept of beauty. Women have been identified as objects of beauty or ugliness across time, culture, and age. Our panel is going to outline how the lenses we use to frame female beauty affect the lives of women, affecting their well-being, their safety, their identity, their relationship to the power structure, and their leadership potential at all levels. As the subject and object of beauty, women are constantly watched, ignored, constrained, and framed by their sexuality, their beauty, or their lack thereof, according to the oracle of the day or the place. This panel outlines that framing and the dire consequences that can follow. We may leave you with more of a negative feeling about the idea of beauty, but we hope that it helps you stop and think about this idea in greater depth. That's the goal. To soothe your soul, you might want to, hark back to Daniel's discussion about the beauty of physics, or Marianne, I saw you walk in here, your discussion about music, or Michelle Kant and the sublime. I mean, you might go back to those moments, but for now, let us dig into this. I am going to be taking time, not on myself, but taking time, so 10 minutes for each of our panelists. I'll go ahead and introduce each of them now so you know what's coming. And the first panelist will be Lori Watson. She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois Chicago in 2004. She joined USD's faculty in 2007. She's currently a professor of philosophy, and that's good because you're in that department, and chair of the department. Her area of expertise includes ethics, political philosophy, philosophy of law, and feminism. She has a couple of books coming out related to this: pornography, Debating Pornography, co-authored with Andrew Altman, and the other is Debating Sex Work with Jessica Flanagan. So today, she's going to address pornography's influence on gendered beauty norms. We have Angela Nurse to my left. Dr. Nurse is a postdoctoral fellow in the College of Arts and Sciences and with the Department of Sociology. She joined USD fall of 2017 after completing her PhD in sociology at Michigan State. Her area of expertise includes fashion, dress, race, and identity. So she will address how the ideals of female beauty are shaped by the hegemonic force of aesthetic whiteness. Erin Lovette-Colyer. She received an MS in Higher Education Administration from Miami University. This is her 11th year at USD. She is the director of USD's Women's Center and is responsible for providing leadership, day-to-day direction, and long-range planning for the center. She works closely with students, administration, and faculty to plan, develop, and execute the program's services and events. She works to create she works to create a campus environment that's welcoming and safe for persons of all races, religions, colors, sexual orientations, and genders, and to gather and share, explore difficult personal, community, and social issues. She will address today beauty as it is tied to privilege and how the sense of belonging and well-being are related to these concepts. Karen Shelby teaches in the Political Science and International Relations program. She received her PhD in Political Science from Rutgers University and has been teaching at USD since the spring of 2009. She is also the Assistant Director of the Institute for Civil and Civic Engagement that's housed here on campus. She teaches a range of courses, including my old favorite, Sex, Power, and Politics, Feminist Theory, Comparative Social Movements, and Political Theory, Ancient to Modern. She will be talking about beauty as seen in Trumpland. Then, our final speaker is Casey Dominguez. Dr. Dominguez received her BA, MA, and PhD from University of California, Berkeley in 2005, and that same year, she joined USD's political science faculty. Her research and teaching interests include a wide range of topics, including American politics, the presidency, parties and interest groups, campaigns, and elections. So she will be concluding by talking about how all of these judgments made in all of these realms and affect how appearance affects the perceptions of our candidates and how they can succeed as leaders, especially women candidates.
I am going to talk, I guess the title of my talk is Pornography and Beauty. It's the beauty part will come at the end, so hopefully you'll be patient with me with a little bit of feminist analysis about gender, how that connects to sexuality, how that connects to pornography, and how that connects to beauty, which is the theme of the thing. So 4 movements. So I have prepared far more material than I possibly have time to cover, as bad academics do, and so I'll try to keep me accountable, Noelle. So the first idea I want to put on the table, and granted this will be a cursory presentation, and challenge me if you like at the end, has to do with the way that normative standards around gender, including gender stereotypes of appropriate masculine and feminine behavior, are central to the social hierarchy between women and men as a class, and how those are central to evaluations of beauty. And we will see in the analysis I'll present that gender isn't simply a difference between the masculine and feminine, but masculine and feminine are organized along hierarchical lines, in which to be masculine socially, of course, this is not an essential or biological account. This is a social reading of the way in which masculinity is performed by individuals in light of the normative standards of masculinity. But masculinity is achieved primarily through a demonstration of an ability to dominate. A lot of examples can reveal this. If you think about sports, a particularly hard hit on the football field with a pointing and a "I own you" is a kind of canonical representative form of masculinity. Femininity, in contrast, is accomplished by social submissiveness and deference in relation to masculinity. This is achieved through beauty norms, as I'll connect to in the end. And so feminine beauty rituals often involve, as many feminists have argued, marking oneself as a sexual object available for consumption by men and available on terms approved of by men, although only to a point. One, of course, can fall off the cliff and then be condemned for being too sexual or too sexy or, slut-shamed, as it's called. I'll note just briefly the longer version of the comments I want to make, as though I'm talking about masculinity and femininity as if they were social categories not mediated by other social categories. That's, of course, false. And so gender, as just described, intersects with other social divisions in the ways that manifest hierarchies within gender groups as well. So, for example, the imperatives of femininity in conjunction with racialized norms create further hierarchies between white women, black women, Latina women, Asian women, Native and Aboriginal women, and so on. And I think some of our other speakers will get to the content and the substance of racialized hierarchy as it plays a role in beauty norms. I'll talk a little bit about that as it plays out in pornography as I move forward. So these gender roles, as I've been describing them, masculine and feminine, are organized and structured into hierarchical statuses. And some feminist analysis locate the central organizing mechanism of gender as a set of social roles, practices, and norms in sexuality, in particular in the institutional norms of heterosexuality. So in this analysis, sexuality is what determines gender as a social role, not the other way around. In other words, the content of the gendered positions, the masculine and the feminine, is determined by the structure of those roles within heterosexuality, the dominant form of sexual roles and their expression. Identifying and understanding the ways in which the norms of heterosexuality shape, define, and embody inequality between men as a class and women as a class is ground zero for understanding sex and gender inequality in all its forms, in my view. Not everyone agrees with that. So let's think about how masculinity is achieved within sexuality, how femininity is achieved in sexuality, how pornography reproduces that, and how it connects to unequal beauty norms and practices as standards of beauty for women. So within sexuality, we might ask ourselves what behaviors and attitudes are constitutive of playing the masculine role in its stereotypical sense. Well, masculinity is achieved through an exercise of power, where that means, among other things, being the sexual actor, that is, being the initiator and the penetrator, as well as having the authority to determine what is sex, whether it happened, and what is erotic. So, for example, to further illuminate this, amassing a large number of sex partners is an achievement of masculinity. The more sex a man has, the more he is, quote, a man. Back slapping, high-fiving, thumbs up, head nods, and other expressions of admiration flow from men to men as sexual conquests are racked up. In contrast, women are viciously punished for sexual activity outside of a monogamous relationship. Men are players, pimps, studs. Women are whores, sluts, easy, dirty if they engage in, quote, too much sex, even in cases where that sex is unwanted, forced, coerced, or extracted by threats. That is, even when they are raped. How much time do I have?
You've got like 5.
Okay. So within this asymmetrical structure, defined as it is by inequality, hierarchy itself is eroticized along gender lines. What it is to be sexy is divided by relationships of domination and subordination, as those track masculinity and femininity. There's a photo essay, and I may pronounce this wrong, so excuse me to no one who's in the room, but or just the gods for mispronouncing this man's name. Ryan Sabine has a photo essay called The Men Ups Project. It's a really interesting thing, Google it. And what he does is he takes men and puts them in the clothing and postures of traditional pinup displays of women. So holding a baseball bat, posturing their bodies in certain ways. And what's really interesting about this photo essay, and I also use it in the classroom, is that for the first time, many people see the oppressive norms of femininity because they look ridiculous when men are doing them. But when women are doing them, they look totally natural, right? So precisely this fusion of women's bodies with sexual availability as defined by heterosexual masculine desire, the fact that that's so complete makes the pinups for women just look normal, and it makes it look when the men are doing this, absurd and ridiculous. So, now to the eroticization of inequality, which is no more apparent than in pornography. In addition to the inequality between men and women and any social inequality you can think of, sorry, bad reading there. In addition to the inequality between men and women, any social inequality you can think of has a subgenre of pornography devoted to it. Racial inequality is sexualized in white master, black slave genres. In Asian themes, subgenres drawing on stereotypes about submissive Asian women and geishas. In depictions of Latina women as quote, oversexed and, quote, hot and fiery. Age inequality is sexualized in teen porn genres with depictions of school-age girls as virgins having their first, quote, encounter with an older man. Child pornography eroticizes the vulnerability of children, as does the pornography of small women said to be over the age of maturity, but presented as if they are children eager for male sexual attention. Incest porn is a popular subgenre, capturing both the inequality of youth and of the parent-child relationship. Age inequality is sexualized through subgenres where older women are made into, quote, grandma porn. Physical disability and inequality are sexualized in genres of pornography that depict persons, largely women, with disabilities including missing limbs and dwarfism. Obesity is an inequality that is sexualized in fat porn. Nazi Jew pornography exists, sometimes presenting Jewish women as eager to enter concentration camps for sexual purposes. The inequality between non-human animals and humans is sexualized in bestiality and crush videos, where women I won't describe it. So the point there is, for any social inequality and hierarchy that exists, you can count on finding a subgenre of pornography that sexualizes that particular form of inequality. So What on earth does this have to do with beauty? You might ask. Well, the pervasiveness of pornography in our culture, its use as a primary tool of sexual education for prepubescent and teens means that it is a pervasive cultural form of education to sexuality and, well, to a particular form of sexuality, one I would argue isn't healthy, and also to socially reinforcing unequal norms of beauty and body that serve in ways to harm both women and men, or boys and girls, although they don't harm them in the same way. Okay, so three things I'll say about the effects of pornography on gendered beauty norms. One, ubiquitous practice among college-age students and younger adults is the complete removal of all pubic hair. This practice is because of pornography and the normalization of the expectation that adult women, and now men, remove all hair associated with their adultness. And this is one way in which pornography shapes and defines ideals of beauty and body, but in ways that reinforce, in my view, grotesque inequalities, right? Children lack pubic hair. Adult women only do if they remove it. And the sexualization of children and teens, especially prepubescent teens, in pornography has played a large social role in our sexualization of youth and the way in which that has become a standard beauty norm. I could talk more about racism and the objectification of women, but I will cede my time.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. As we reflect on beauty, we often think of the most positive aspects of our lives, our society. We think of USD and the beauty it projects. We tend to give in fully to the halo effect, where beauty is equated with goodness and positivity. But underneath the halo lies a dark underbelly of beauty, wherein beauty is inherently an exclusive category that inevitably leaves something or someone out. We typically think of this as a personal choice. Beauty is, in fact, in the eye of the beholder. But within sociology, we have examined the threads that seem to lead us to similar assessments of who or what is beautiful, and how groups of people tend to evaluate the same thing as beautiful and the impact that has on our society. In the case today, as we explore feminine beauty, I want to point out the racialized ideas of beauty that have become dominant and hold a powerful position in society. In the US, and honestly across the globe, there's a hegemonic idealization of symbols of whiteness, such as straight hair, light skin, particular eye shapes, narrow noses. This hegemonic standard of beauty is so pervasive that it has a powerful discursive impact on interpersonal assessments of beauty and of attractiveness. This means that although symbols of beauty fluctuate over time, the dominant notions of beauty revolve around a moving target of aesthetic whiteness, wherein the popular and dominant ideas of beauty flow out of our socially constructed and reconstructive ideas of what it means to be white. This preference for aesthetic whiteness seeps into how we see the world and plays a powerful role in societal outcomes. The impact can be significant. Beauty, similar to other types of symbolic or cultural capital, operates as an aesthetic capital that can be traded for other resources, material or otherwise. Not merely having a job opened for a pretty blonde or free access to a nightclub, but things like job status, income potential, marriageability, social network power, and access to educational systems. All of which signal that the level of stakes for beauty matters. They're quite high. But unfortunately, unevenly, which we would expect because not everyone or everything is beautiful. But we don't see the random relationship that we might expect to see if the case was truly in the eye of the beholder. In fact, our notions of beauty here in the US are so wound up with whiteness that it has a discursive impact in how we look at and evaluate other people. To that end, I want to bring your attention to a study published by Robert Rees in 2016 using the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health. He found that when people identified as being mixed or partially white, other people assessed them as more attractive than if they identified as one racial group. This is known as the biracial bias of beauty. But what's most interesting about Reese's study is that the biracial bias of beauty was more important than skin color and other racialized phenotypes such as hair color or eye color. The darkness of the skin, this was among women of color, didn't matter. The mere identification of being biracial gave the person a boost in perceived attractiveness. By changing the racial designation from Black or African American to mixed or biracial, changes how we assess the person's beauty. In social settings, we don't merely assess beauty by skin color or even the evolutionary defined characteristics like facial symmetry or waist to hip ratios. Rather, being defined as beautiful represents an accomplishment that combines a number of symbols and signals which must be recognized by the right audience. As individuals, it's our job then to cobble together through our aesthetic labor and body work the right symbols. One could be changing racial designation to biracial or mixed, but the more common forms of aesthetic labor are things like hairstyling, body positioning, waist training, makeup application, etc. These often daily practices, once recognized as beautiful by the world around us, enable us to access aesthetic capital. Dealing with the dominant construction of beauty day in and day out, and constantly performing body work with the hopes of amassing aesthetic capital is burdensome for women across the board. But for marginalized women, due to race or sexuality, class, ability, the labor can be exceptionally arduous and often ineffective. For example, women of color often must engage in additional layers of body work to mediate their racialized phenotypes just to fit in, let alone access beauty capital or aesthetic capital. As is the case for example, women who were terminated because their hair was considered too kinky, curly in texture to be worn out, or students who were expelled from school for similarly inappropriate hairstyles like afro puffs that were listed in violation of school dress codes. These cases, while extreme, demonstrate the difficulty of women of color have at even accessing the bare minimum of social acceptability, let alone beauty. So if a person's already marginalized, is aesthetic labor even effective? Is there enough lipstick or hair products to mediate downplay blackness? What are the appropriate techniques to make Black women beautiful in a society that places a premium on whiteness? Of course, this isn't the only consideration women of color face. The dominant notion of beauty may devalue anything associated with Blackness or otherness, but it doesn't mean that alternatives don't exist. There are additional constructions of beauty that arise out of various racialized communities. As a result, these communities present an alternative and maybe subversive definition of beauty. So there are options. Women then wade through the various constructions of beauty to cherry pick parts of the dominant framework as well as other constructions of beauty to decide what they should look like on that particular day. It's rarely an either or, but a hybrid drawn from multiple sources. In my own research in beauty and body work, I interviewed Black women who spoke explicitly about dressing for racial demographics. They recognized their status as Black women put them at a disadvantage, so they were careful about self-presentation as they traversed in various racialized spaces. Their choices reflected those of rational actors strategizing on how best to maximize their impression. At times, they dressed for ideas of beauty that existed outside the dominant discourse, particular when the stakes were low, such as hanging out with friends at home or in social space dominated by other African Americans. At other times, they did their best to accommodate by engaging in respectability politics of dress. The pressure of beauty is omnipotent, and whether it is the dominant construction in the media or some alternative, there are real potential gains to be had by being defined as beautiful. The hours spent on body work and the aesthetic labor are not endemic of dupes who have been convinced by the media to devalue their bodies, but of rational actors who recognize what the stakes are and are hoping to successfully navigate institutions that value beauty. I'll leave you with a story about a Black woman I read about recently. She was said to have kept a beautiful mahogany-esque suit skirt in her closet that was well out of her typical price range for clothing, a truly beautiful ensemble. She pulled this out whenever she went to DHS offices. When wearing this outfit, she got results. It changed how she was seen in the space, enabled her to be taken seriously and access services. She recognized the aesthetic capital that she possessed, and she often lent her support to friends and neighbors by putting on the suit and accompanying them to the office. The payoff was profound. It reminds us that we can't dismiss the role of beauty in our society as a woman's issue or a superficial trap, but is representative of how we understand and assess what is good, right, acceptable, and important. Thank you.
Thank you.
There were moments throughout the past week or so that I was wondering why I was on this panel, but I'm very excited to be on this panel. It's incredible people. But here I am with no wealth or body of research, but my experience with Ellie. Sorry, Ellie's one of my students here in the Women's Center now that I've totally outed you. Thank you. Okay, so a bit of background on me. I have been at USD for almost 11 years, with 10 of those as the director of the Women's Center. I often joke with people that I'm the best director the Women's Center has ever had. To be clear, I'm the only director the Women's Center has ever had. But I consider myself blessed to work at USD and in the Women's Center. I also recognize the irony in which I find myself working at the USD Women's Center. To be transparent, as a high school senior from Anaheim, California, the last place I wanted to go to college was USD. I wanted to get away from Southern California's material lifestyle that I'd grown up with. I wanted to get away from pretty people. At the time, USD represented many of the things I longed to get away from. An additional disclosure, it was 1993. It was the height of the grunge music scene in Washington, and I wanted to move to Seattle and meet Eddie Vedder. Anyway, I'm also showing my age quite a bit. Anyway, I digress. So the irony of it, it has been working at the Women's Center at USD, where I've walked alongside students and colleagues in exploring and challenging the capitalistic, patriarchal society that shaped my ideas of beauty all those years ago. It's here where I spend my days addressing issues of privilege, power, and oppression, and how beauty is intertwined with all of those. And, by the way, patriarchy and capitalism are alive and well in Seattle as well. I learned that. I did not escape that by leaving Southern California. In talking with students in preparation for today, I asked folks who work in the Women's Center to share what came to mind when they thought of beauty within the context of USD. I knew this to be a loaded question for my students. Some talked about the physical beauty of our campus, the Spanish Renaissance architecture, the well-kept manicured grounds, sitting on a hill overlooking the ocean, our ranking as the most beautiful campus in the United States. Some students went to the stereotype of the USD woman, white, long blonde hair, physically fit, hyper-feminine, and wealthy. Both of these examples took us to the problem of beauty. One student shared that for her, here at USD, beauty is bound up in privilege. Based on my work at USD, her lived experience rings true for many of our students. Students spoke of the USD woman not because most students fully fit this stereotype, but rather the stereotype represents the larger messages they've received throughout their lives, that based on their race, class, sexuality, they don't live up to society's standard of beauty, and because of that, they don't belong. The problem of beauty, ultimately, is who gets to define it. Noelle spoke earlier of the quote and the bookmark. I've always thought it would be really cool. I'm feeling a lot of pressure since Sister Jen is here. I'm like, hi. Anyway, so I always thought it would be cool to meet Mother Rosalie Hill and to get a better understanding of the history of our institution. I always picture her to be kind of quite the firecracker. I think she'd be really cool. I'm sure she is. Anyway, I have wondered over my time here at USD what her thought process was in coming up with the idea of beauty, goodness, and truth. Was she cognizant of her whiteness? Did she consider how white supremacy within the US might shape her definitions? How capitalistic patriarchy has directed our understanding of what is beautiful, who is good, and who determines the truth? I'm left to think that Mother Hill's definitions were in some way shaped by the society in which she was living at the time. So here we are, living in a world where standard ideas of beauty are virtually unattainable. Women are made to feel inadequate if they aren't striving to meet that ideal. Women are told that if they just had more self-confidence, they wouldn't be as affected by the patriarchy. We talk about empowerment a lot in the Women's Center. We also talk about the reality of the damage patriarchy has done to our psyches. We unpack how we've internalized sexism and how it is present in all aspects of our lives. I think about so many of our students who have allowed me to bear witness to the trauma that they've experienced. That trauma presents itself as a student's world becomes consumed by her eating disorder, as a student speaks to the fat shaming that has been thrown at her entire life. Almost 60% of college-age women feel unhappy about their weight. 91% of women are unhappy with their bodies and have resorted to dieting to achieve their ideal body shape. 1 in 10 women will suffer from disordered eating behaviors. That trauma presents itself when a victim survivor of sexual assault grapples with the childhood messages she received that taught her to equate her worth with her body. 1 in 5 women will be assaulted during college. That trauma presents itself when a student feels isolated because they don't identify within the gender binary. 41% of transgender and gender nonconforming people will attempt suicide. I do my best to support students on their journeys, but it's a lot to hold. I'm surrounded by students, many of them marginalized, and many dealing with incredible trauma. These are students who experience the brunt of patriarchy and white supremacy. They are also students most passionate about creating change in this world, change that will lead to the improvement of others' lives and of their own. These are the students who have invited me to say, screw hegemonic ideas of beauty. Social justice and equity work is not pretty. It's exhausting, isolating, but in its truest form, it is incredibly beautiful. Passion, empowerment, vulnerability, joy, love, compassion, empathy, authenticity. These are the concepts that guide my understanding of beauty today and the work that I try to lead in the Women's Center. To be clear, our patriarchal, capitalistic society pushes back on this understanding for me on a daily basis. As part of Envisioning 2024 here at USD, the Division of Student Affairs is focusing our energies on addressing students' well-being and sense of belonging. As I sit here and give a glimpse of what some of our students experience, I know that well-being and sense of belonging are critical. However, we cannot lose sight of the problem of beauty situated within the history of our institution.
Thank you, Erin. So, Trumpland would not be my choice of place to be, but it seemed important talking about the idea of beauty, to think about the way in which our political leadership shapes how we understand women's place in political spaces. And of course, Trump has a very particular version of what that looks like, one that accords quite well with many of the things that we've already been discussing, but that has a particular twist, especially as he leads our nation. So this is why we're taking that particular trip today. And taking it, you mentioned the Kantian, and certainly thinking about what does it mean to be educated to judge as a community member or citizen, what it means to be a part of that place. And that's really what I'm aiming for us to think about today. So in the campaign and presidency of Donald Trump, beauty has been defined for women in a variety of ways, although the margin is not too great. For example, in running against Carly Fiorina in the Republican primary, and you may remember these things, but I'm re-invoking them so that we think about how bringing them all together shapes our common political space. He argued against her candidacy on the ground of her lack of beauty. Look at that face. Would anyone vote for that? Can you imagine that, the face of our next president? And so certainly, the aesthetic standard is part of what should govern the way that you vote in the Republican primary. Likewise, when he turned to the presidential election, Hillary Clinton apparently didn't have a presidential look either. And candidate Trump noted after one of the debates, "When she walked in front of me, believe me, I wasn't impressed." In Trump's world, women fall into the category of the beautiful, objects of patronizing or covetous approval, or the non-beautiful, lacking in suitability for presence in the public realm by virtue of their faces and their hips, apparently. And when they fail to offer him proper deference or offer a challenge to him, they are subject to removal from the public arena, expunged via his proclamations from what is fit to be seen, if you will, in the Arendtian sense. Now, women who do accord with Trump's notions of beauty receive approval. For example, when on a visit to France, President Trump greeted Brigitte Macron, wife of President Emmanuel Macron, with the bizarre accolade, I mean, not so bizarre in Trump land, but bizarre for one world leader to another and spouse. "You're in such good shape." Then he turned to her husband, reaffirming, right, because who owns her? Must be her husband. "She's in such good physical shape." Then finally the assertion, "Beautiful." In Trump world, a woman must first of all be beautiful, and she must work to achieve it, of course. And the man who owns her is to be congratulated for this as well. This is the mindset of the incel, the involuntarily celibate man, owed access to women's bodies, and not just any bodies, but the beautiful ones not available to those who claim membership within this group. Alex Manassian's and Elliot Rogers' violent actions have uncovered an extreme worldview in which Chads have sexual access to Stacys, right? And who sees himself as the ultimate Chad but Donald Trump, to whom access to the Stacys should be given, should he choose so. And sex inequality is the lack of sexual access to beautiful women on the part of the incel. To Lori's point, it's about the hierarchy of male access. And as I was looking at some of these different things and thinking about it, I even ran across an economist, I'm going to get the university wrong, so I'm not going to say it, but who has mapped out this whole system for thinking about the ranking of what women should be accessible to what men, and why, because of their sexual social capital. And of course, as Lori pointed out, more sex on the part of women renders their ranking lower, and therefore they are accessible to lower ranked men. But this is what sex inequality looks like in this worldview. It's not about unequal pay, it's not about disparate outcomes in different kinds of legal processes. It's about what men have sexual access to what women and why they are owed that. Now, in all of this, and as we've seen in my fellow panelists' presentations, women are simply viewed as objects, and women who enter the political arena are no less subject to this objectifying treatment. It takes different pathways, however, depending on the candidate who presents in the public arena. Diana Carlin and Kelly Winfrey have identified 4 different sexist tropes that shape the perceptions of women political candidates. So it's not just in Trump land where we find this, it's in society as a whole. We've already explored 2 of them. Carly Fiorina and Hillary Clinton evoke the Iron Maiden. Need I mention the Hillary Clinton nutcracker? Sarah Palin was paradigmatic of the sex object, rendered as a blow-up doll, so you could, quote, show her how you're going to vote. The 2, which dovetails perfectly with, Lori's presentation. The 2 additional tropes are the mother and the pet child. Women are often lauded for their skills in the private arena as mothers, but it subtly undercuts their commitment to or experience in the public sphere in voters' minds. And the pet child is too immature to make her own decisions, so why would you want her making them for you? In all of these, the defining characteristics are ones that undermine the capabilities of women to navigate the political environment, and therefore, of course, actually receive your vote. Now, I always like to look at, I'm actually an optimist at heart, so it's a little painful to go here, but thinking about this and reading it through the lens of a wonderful article about race and gendering in Congress by Mary Hawksworth, one of the things that Hawksworth finds that Congresswomen of color respond to this intersectional animus from their colleagues with is resistance. And of course, thinking about resistance is where I want to go with this. How are we resisting against this toxic vision of beauty and what it means for us in Trump land? So, one Trump-era instance of resistance happened the other night at the Correspondents' Dinner, and there's a certain irony that Michelle Wolf, who's being critiqued for attacking Sarah Huckabee Sanders' appearance, was ironically using a very deft tool that only, in my opinion, a woman comic could manage, to both critique Sarah Huckabee Sanders for the lies she tells for her president as press secretary, while complimenting her application of smoky eyeshadow, right? And, for those of you who are, sitting there going, what is smoky eyeshadow, right? I would not be able to put on the smoky eyeshadow. Probably, I dare say, most of us in this room would not. But the deftness of that particular pointed political commentary. And what's disheartening about that is that the outrage has been not about the fact that she was accused of lying, but about the fact that her appearance was commented upon. So it makes me think we need to do more about thinking about our judgments about when beauty is invoked and what meaning that has. Now, another instance of resistance, of course, is Elizabeth Warren persisting in bringing the words of Coretta Scott King into the Senate record while she was opposing Jeff Sessions' nomination as Attorney General. Nevertheless, she persisted has become an invocation of women's existence and women's voice, and a call to action. And finally, women's marches as well have marked resistance to these visions, these Trumpian visions of women. Nasty women wearing pussy hats have taken to our public spaces to show that the vision of femininity and its place in this nation that is espoused by Trump and his supporters is not the one that many women claim for themselves, right? With the hard work that Erin was invoking. In preparing for this panel, I figured out that I don't know what beauty is. But research, right, pays off. Plotinus has described its effect in a very compelling way, right? You gotta go there. This is the spirit that beauty must ever induce: wonderment and a delicious trouble, longing and love and a trembling that is all delight. I call on feminists, men, women, and others, to foment delicious trouble in these times when notions of beauty have been perverted and flattened, when wonderment is itself a form of rebellion. Thank you.
I'm going to speak a little bit differently. I'm a political scientist like Erin and like Noelle, but I'm just on the empirical side. What I can tell you about is what is the evidence that we have about the degree to which voters actually think about and process the beauty or attractiveness of political candidates, and what effect might that have on election outcomes. So I'm going to try to address three questions. One, first of all, do voters consider candidates' beauty when they're voting? Second, given everything we've been talking about, there would be reasons to believe that that might affect women more than men or affect women differently than men, so do we see that? And then third, does that have any impact on who actually succeeds in leadership roles or who gets elected to office? The answer is it's complicated, actually. It's not as straightforward as one might imagine. So let me start with how do we measure the attractiveness of candidates? How would you go about measuring that? Various people across the social sciences and social psychology and economics and political science have presented voters or presented people in laboratory settings with images of candidates and asked them to make judgments about whether they're beautiful, whether they're attractive, and then other characteristics that, like, what do you see this face of this person? What do you think when you see this face? One of the things that all of this research finds is that voters, people who are in experiments, are very capable of making snap judgments in milliseconds about the beauty of the face that they're looking at. and also about other traits, the competence, the honesty, the potential threat posed by the face. So we are sort of biologically capable of making very quick, unconscious judgments about the faces that we see. Now, when you're presenting this in a laboratory setting to people and you say, candidate A, candidate B, who's more attractive, who would you vote for? The evidence there is actually kind of mixed. In some studies, it sort of goes the way you might imagine, that people pick the most beautiful candidate, whether that's male or female, and usually they pair these male-male or female-female so that gender isn't a confounding variable, so they're looking at attractiveness in a gender-neutral way, if that's possible. There are some studies that show that the more attractive candidate gets more votes, and that actually is correlated with election outcomes in interesting ways. But there's also evidence that goes the other way. There are studies that show that people more or less vote for the less attractive candidate. And there's also reasons why we might expect that to be the case. And in terms of exactly what it is that constitutes beauty, there are a number of these studies that really focus on facial features, minus no hair, no clothing, just the facial features themselves. They might be getting at something biological about the symmetry of the face or the squareness of the jaw or whatever it is. But then there are other studies that show that it's not just the face. It is posture and hair and clothing and things that are more sort of that indicate social status or other kinds of competence. And there's this one study that says that people are more likely to vote for candidates who smile, but there isn't 100% clarity about exactly whether voters are responding to beauty and how they're responding to it. There is a lot more evidence in political science that what voters are seeing in candidates' faces is not necessarily beauty but competence, or what they're looking for when they're evaluating candidates for office is not beauty but competence. And there's a couple of different pieces of evidence for that. One of them is that there's at least one study that shows that voters who, in these experimental settings, if they have to make a millisecond snap judgment, can tell you who's more attractive. But then if given a little bit of time, people who are more politically sophisticated correct for that. And they say, well, I'm not supposed to be selecting the prettiest person. So they deliberately rate, or they actually rate the less attractive person more highly, with the argument, or maybe the assumption that competence and beauty are not related to, or inversely related to each other. And there is maybe there's some additional evidence about that associated with masculinity and femininity. Competence is associated with masculine attractiveness, but competence is negatively associated with feminine attractiveness. And so I haven't seen a study that does this particularly, but it does seem like there might be reason to believe that attractiveness might be affecting men and women differently in regards to how voters perceive their competence. And of course, that would go along with the idea that the feminine is not dominant and other things like that. So it seems like attractiveness might make a difference. It's not entirely clear, but actually I want to put that in quite a bit of perspective. We have an election coming up in 35 days. Really important races in the county of San Diego, where I assume most people vote. Show of hands, how many people have seen a picture of someone who's running for office in 35 days? Anybody seen a picture of a candidate? Maybe 10, 20%, maybe a third. So a lot of voters never see a picture of a candidate. And so when we study election outcomes, attractiveness was never something that ever makes the list. You can get to sort of the candidate as a holistic being at the very bottom of the list. Actually, candidates matter very little in most races. Most races are determined by people's views about party and policy, about issues, and actually there's a lot of research about partisanship that says that partisanship will go the other way, that it affects our perception so much that if you are a Democrat and you're looking at a very attractive Republican, you will not think they're actually attractive, right? Your partisanship, there might be some millisecond where you can recognize that's an attractive face, but it's not going to take you very long to decide that they're ugly and horrific looking. And so that's that partisan thinking, those partisan blinders and that partisan cognition has a lot more to do with how we vote than necessarily sort of conventional ideas about beauty in candidates. Now, of course, once you get past partisanship, the campaign matters, and so candidates can choose to emphasize their face or present themselves personally in ways that might play into, might affect voters in ways that are very hard to measure. And in addition to that, the news covers candidates. Now, actually, the news doesn't cover most candidates for most offices. You're not going to see a lot of even local news coverage about even important local races, right? They're going to tell you about sports and weather and the president and very little else. So most candidates never make the news, but to the degree that the news covers candidates, we know that the news media does tend to talk more about the appearance of women. There's much more commentary about how Hillary Clinton looked or how about Carly Fiorina looked than there was about, well, I suppose Marco Rubio had the water bottle incident, but and
John Edwards' haircut.
for the most part, we're not talking about how the men look.
No.
Yeah. And even that, we're just talking about the presidential race, and mostly you're not going to hear about that in most of the things we vote for. So when it comes to news coverage and when it comes to candidate self-presentation, there may be some ways. Obviously, candidates are always trying to package themselves in the most positive ways possible. Women, of course, will have to think about their self-presentation. They'll have to think about where do you want to be in those 4 boxes or along the spectrum of how do you want to present yourself in what kind of clothing and in what kind of settings and how much makeup to wear and all of those kinds of things. But men are going to do that too, and it's not clear that any of that makes a difference above and beyond the other things that we think about when we're voting. When we think about who gets elected to office, women win just as often as men when they're paired when they're on the general election ballot. The reason that fewer women run for office, or the reason that fewer women get elected to office, is really more that women don't run, and to the degree that that's associated with negative self-perception or lack of confidence that is driven by some of the things that the other panelists have been talking about, that probably seems to have a bigger effect on who leaders end up being than when it finally gets to the voters themselves. So I hope I've made sense of a large body of literature there.
I don't know. You're 9 minutes and 42 seconds, just the other side of Karen. So, do the panelists have anything they want to ask each other, or shall I open it up? Panel questions of the audience, from the audience, not of the audience. We're gonna ask
I got a
you
lot of
questions.
questions for you guys.
Daniel.
Yeah. Casey, I have a question. Something you said really quite interesting. You said male attractiveness is somehow perceived as competence, but female attractiveness does not correlate or negatively correlates with that. Does competence in a female correlate with how masculine they look, for instance? Is that a possibility?
This has not been studied well enough for me to be able to give that answer. I would expect that goes into the self-presentation. I mean, I think we can see that in the way that women candidates present themselves.
I can chime into another.
Yeah.
I can chime into another context in terms of while not in the election or in the political sphere, in terms of job interviews, women who are perceived as more attractive we tend to associate them with a higher level of femininity, which then, as Lori talks about, kind of reifies this category of gender binary wherein women are in the subordinate position. So in terms of leadership, in so much as the woman is more beautiful, she tends to be seen as less competent, less capable, because she embodies this idea of femininity more so. Also, in the context of a job interview and whatnot, men's attractiveness tends to boost them up as well. So we see that same inverse relationship in terms of if women are just competing against other women for a job, potentially the attractiveness can give a boost in terms of level of competence. So it's really dependent on the context in which, and if we're talking about comparing men or women, or if women are being assessed with each other.
And makeup plays a huge role in the assessment of women's competence. So there's been studies that show women
Absolutely.
who refuse to or don't wear makeup are downgraded in terms of competence, and women with some, but not too much, makeup get a boost in terms of, you know, the studies where they show the faces with and without makeup, and you rate someone's competence based on a photo, which is obviously an effective indicator of competence. But makeup plays a big role in evaluating women.
I'd throw in one other data point here, and that is thinking about women veterans who run for office and their self-presentation. To some extent, as veterans, especially if they've been deployed, they have overcome the bar of kind of masculinized competence at the same time that they really need to present themselves as attractive women as well, right? So they've kind of trying to check off both boxes, and a lot of them are actually managing to navigate that.
One thing to add, though, is women do have to walk the double bind between appearing
Yeah.
competent and being bitchy.
Yes.
So women leaders are often, or assertive women, which would be a highly valued trait in men. He's competent, a leader, and so on, get, you know, downgraded as, you know, uncontrollable bitches.
You're Iron Maiden,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
Marianne,
Isn't
and then
there
Mike.
a cultural bias too here? I mean, think of Angela Merkel in Germany, and how often have I heard American people say she could have never, ever been elected in the United States?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely.
There must be, this must be true for other cultures. I mean, I know these two cultures well, but what about other cultures? France? Aren't you from?
Sure. I mean,
France?
part of my interest in this is because of a year I spent in France, where I was walking down the street as an exchange student, and the street was blocked off, and I asked this police guy who was standing there, you know, like, oh, what's going on? You know, why can't I walk where I normally walk? And he said, ah, c'est la salade. And of course, he was talking about, now I've just lost her name, the first woman prime minister of France. And Edith Cresson, right? Because cresson is a form of lettuce. But that whole edible woman trope of, you know, like she's a salad, and think about, you know, salad greens, do they stay around for very long? No, they're, you know, very droopy and not, you know. So that was a disparaging name for, you know, Edith Cresson when she was, you know, a political leader in France. So it's, you know, the standards are very, you know, certainly each culture has its own place, but, you know, there are certain observable patterns. Women tend to come to prominence when their party is in crisis. And so, you know, it's a lose-lose proposition for, you know, if a guy takes over and, you know, he doesn't resuscitate the party, then, you know, he's no good, and it's a challenge to do that. So women often have these moments, but interestingly, women stay in power longer if they are successful. So there's some funky data in there too about women's competence once they're given the opportunity to manifest it. But getting over that hurdle of managing to be elected is part of the challenge.
One thing to throw in there is that the U.S. is actually one of the few democratic nations that don't have quota systems.
Yeah.
And so where you have to elect a certain number of women, and I guess at that point, when you've got you might not have the pool of beautiful women to elect, and it becomes something that you set aside. I don't know, where some of Casey's data might answer some of that. I don't know. Quotas, I think, take away that argument, but I have no data. Yeah. Mike.
I'm probably going to fumble as I try to formulate the question. So I was thinking about some types of virtues or character traits that are often, say, like, you know, predominantly applied to woman but not to man, and to what extent they're bound up with the category of beauty itself. So if you think about kind of dominant virtues, again, that we apply predominantly to women but not to man, we think of things like caring, poised, graceful, right? It would be kind of strange to hear people describe a male as poised or graceful outside of sporting events, for example. And then to what extent are those virtues, like, kind of like defining feminine character traits, kind of bound up with or conditioned by the very notion of beauty, right? Grace and beauty, poise and beauty, care, and at least kind of like bodily affective orientation. So just wondering if you guys work these.
I can speak explicitly to that. Yes, you're absolutely right. One of the measures of femininity is to be able to check off some of these boxes of beauty. The very idea of what it means to be a woman means you're assessed in terms of your relationship to be able to embody those character traits which beauty is all bound up in. And so one of the problems with women of color face is that by not even having access to that kind of ideal notion of beauty, it's kind of means that you're not considered as much as of a woman, and so your likelihood to experience sexual violence or is higher, or your likelihood to be believed that you've experienced sexual violence is higher, because somehow you're not a woman in the same way. You exist outside of that binary. So you're absolutely right. The idea of beauty is very much one of the measures that we use to define the very category of womanhood, of gender, of femininity.
I think one thing to add to that too, that none of us spoke about, interestingly, was the relationship between age and beauty norms, and the way that women, as they age, become desexualized,
Invisible.
degendered,
Yeah.
and they're like in the grandma role, or we don't know what to do with them, right?
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. So yeah,
Absolutely. When you age out almost of
right.
the category of beauty, you become insignificant to society.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's certainly part of the Trumpian dismissal of, say, a Carly Fiorina or a Hillary Clinton. Nancy Pelosi certainly gets that. But it's funny, when you started speaking, I'm like, oh, right, and the virtue of chastity, right? Which is another one that comes of, another of those feminine virtues that comes along with that. And, beauty is also in the preservation of that, witness the, slut shaming that goes on.
There was also a pornography just of Sarah Palin, a parody made. It was called Nail and Palin.
Oh,
And there were a number of iterations of it in which,
Yeah.
but this is a way, and there have been similar things of women in power where they've been parodied in pornography as a way of, stripping them of status and power and reducing them to a sexual object.
Prior to 1992, women tended to wear, women candidates would wear dark suits and they'd try to be as dark and as black and as masculine as possible. After 92, and Ann Richards in Texas,
Right.
she kind of broke that mold, wore the beehive hair and pink suits. And the candidates that came out in 92 and won in great number were colorful. So then you move along and they go through the years. Then you get to Hillary in 2008, where she was not only colorful, but she showed her cleavage.
Right.
And that
And
where
wore pants.
and
Pants.
so the mix of her sexuality and the femininity became a pretty focused event.
Yeah.
And I remember the cameras just going in on. Whoa, her shirt's a little low.
Right.
I wanted to conclude with one note. You may not realize that we started this whole discussion out, the second one after Sister Rhodey's was about Plotinus. And thank you, Karen, for bringing it all the way back to something related to Plotinus. But also, just this last piece, we started out with USD and the concept of beauty, goodness, and truth with Sister Rhodey's kickoff on February 6th. And we're ending with a question about USD and how we handle beauty and identity. And I think that's just a brilliant way to end.